Hello everyone, we are back with the law offices of Mark Ruiz. Today we are going to talk about asset protection. Mark, can you tell us a little bit about what is asset protection?
Yes, asset protection is a means by which one can title their assets so that they are a less vulnerable target for litigation. Asset protection basically means protecting your assets. So if you own a home, if you own investment property, if you own stocks, when you're sued, if that happens, you're less likely to have to forfeit your assets to creditors.
Okay, great. So why would somebody want to have an asset protection plan in place?
That's a great question, Henriette. The reason why one would want to have an asset protection strategy in place is because the United States is a very litigious society. There are often plaintiff lawyers who will sue business owners, for example, or medical doctors, or anybody that has a high net worth, and they'll take it on a contingency. Now, if a person has assets that are titled in a way that they are unlikely to be able to satisfy a judgment because the assets are protected, the plaintiff's attorneys are less likely to take on the case to begin with because they're not going to get a contingency fee. So the reason why somebody would have an asset protection strategy is so that they could be a less vulnerable target for litigation, and also if they are sued, they'll have to forfeit less of their assets if they're properly protected.
Okay. So in order to avoid this, can you tell us a little bit about what are various strategies for asset protection?
Sure, and this is a kind of a complicated topic. Of course, I'm not going to be able to cover everything today, but I'll go over the basics. And
okay.
I've come up with a few different strategies, and these are tried and true strategies that other asset protection attorneys use. And they are LLCs, and I particularly recommend Nevada and Wyoming, limited partnerships, asset protection trusts, offshore asset protection strategies, equity stripping, and exemptions.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about how LLCs work and all that?
Sure, yeah. So in the context of asset protection, LLCs are great, especially when we're dealing with Nevada and Wyoming LLCs, because LLCs are a charging order protected entity, which means that if you title, for example, real estate property in an LLC, the only remedies that in certain states, Nevada and Wyoming, I'm going to qualify that a creditor can obtain against the LLC are charging orders, which means that they can only attach the distributions from the LLC to the members, but not the underlying assets themselves. So, for example, say you own a $500,000 investment property. The underlying $500,000 investment property won't be subject to creditor's claim, but the rent from it, if it's distributed to a member of the LLC, will be attached. So what you would do is you would hold the earnings and let them accumulate in the LLC. And the beauty of charging order protected entities like Nevada and Wyoming LLCs is that if you hold a charging order against one of these, even if the earnings are not distributed, the owner of the charging order or the beneficiary of the charging order will still have to pay taxes on it. So you might be taxed on $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 that is earnings of the LLC, but it's not distributed, and so you'll have to pay taxes on it, but you won't benefit from it. So therefore, not a lot of people want to hold a charging order.
I see. Okay. Is there any other states in the United States that you would recommend, or Nevada and Wyoming is the best?
I do, having researched it, I do believe Nevada and Wyoming are by far the best states for LLCs for asset protection. California is not quite as good because if it's a multiple member LLC, if it's a single member LLC, the charging order protection is not quite there the way it is for Nevada and Wyoming. So I do recommend Nevada and Wyoming for LLCs if you're interested in asset protection.
Okay. How about limited partnerships?
Yeah, limited partnerships offer a lot of the same protection as LLCs. and you could craft a limited partnership in such a way that you could hold an asset in this limited partnership and have very similar protection as you would from a Nevada and Wyoming LLC. So that's another strategy that I could recommend in certain circumstances. But again, like with limited partnership, there would have to be more than one person to form that limited partnership. There would be a managing partner, and then there's limited partners. So that is another entity that could help with asset protection.
Okay, so you had mentioned asset protection trust. Could you please tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So in some of the same states that are great for LLCs like Nevada and Wyoming, they also offer these asset protection trusts, which are great because you could title your property in an asset protection trust. And the key to that is that the trust would be irrevocable, and that the trustee would have some discretion to distribute the assets to the beneficiary, which would be the owner of the asset. And so you can't just use it as your piggy bank. You'd have to specify the terms. But when done properly, and especially in combination with LLCs, asset protection trusts can be great. And again, Nevada and Wyoming are the best states for these asset protection trusts. And I want to clarify something. Oftentimes people think that a living trust is a great asset protection tool. And that is absolutely not the case. Living trusts in and of themselves do not protect your assets.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How about offshore asset protection? How does that work?
Offshore asset protection, oftentimes people really have a need for additional protection, and they want to put their assets offshore in certain jurisdictions. For example, the Isle of Man and Nevis and the Cook Islands. Those are great jurisdictions for offshore asset protection. It's more expensive to do that, but if you really, really want to insulate your assets and keep them in a way that is less likely to be discovered, and even offer additional protections from the reach of the United States courts, in certain circumstances, asset protection attorneys recommend offshore asset protection. Jurisdictions like the ones I mentioned.
Okay. And equity stripping, what is that? Tell us.
Equity stripping is when you own an asset with a lot of equity. If you encumber it with a loan at a low interest rate, your mortgage holder will get first priority rather than the general unsecured creditors. And so say you have $1 million property, you take out an $800,000 second mortgage or first mortgage or whatever if you own it outright, that would reduce the equity in your property. And now with interest rates so low, that's actually a good option, because rather than having $1 million in equity, you'd have $200,000 in equity, but you'd be paying low interest on a loan. Makes your property less vulnerable to creditors.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the last one, exemptions.
Exemptions are, in each state you have a certain amount of exemptions which you're entitled to. You could exempt your assets from creditors. And Florida is a great state for exemptions because they have an unlimited homestead exemption, which were, last I checked, the law may have changed, but as far as I know, Florida has a great homestead exemption. California also does, but Florida, you could exempt your home if you live in it from creditors. And so a lot of these very wealthy people, when they're being sued, or when they think they are likely at some point to be sued, will buy a house in Florida and live there because it's less likely to be within the reach of creditors. And other assets are exemption too, like for example, Social Security, money that you get from Social Security is exempt. And exemptions basically assets which are by law out of reach to creditors. And there's certain assets that are. So for example, you have your homestead exemption, a portion of your home equity, and in some cases a great portion, like in the case of Florida, is exempt from creditors' claims. So basically, by knowing the exemption systems, you could structure your asset ownership in such a way that you own exempt assets. Mm-hmm. And one thing I'm going to, before we close, I'm going to say, the best time to get started on an asset protection strategy is before you are being sued. Because if you are already being sued, your asset protection strategy is likely to be set aside as part of what's known as a fraudulent transfer under the Uniform Fraudulent Transfer Act. So it's better to structure your assets in such a way before you're sued.
Okay. So can the law offices of Mark Ruiz help with asset protection? If so, how?
Sure, yeah. The law offices of Mark Ruiz provides advice to people that are looking to protect their assets, and we could help them structure entities and plan for their asset protection strategy, and I'm happy to help out.
Okay. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.